There are certain moments in a marriage when the man you thought you were turns out to be a stranger. I met him in a deserted garage in Raleigh, North Carolina, in February 2024. He was cold, confused, standing in motor oil and darkness, fists against a locked steel door while the woman he had loved for 11 years stood on the other side of it, listening. My name is Benjamin Ward. I'm 44 years old. And my wife, the woman who wore my grandmother's ring, who I drove 4 hours to propose to on top of Chimney Rock, who cried at our wedding while I tried not to, locked me in a garage and smiled doing it. Not because I threatened her, not because I raised my hand, not because I betrayed her in any way that matters. She did it because I said no. And that, as I would learn over the next 24 hours, was the one word Sandra Ward had decided she would never accept from me again. Let me take you back 6 weeks. January 2024. Raleigh, North Carolina. My mother, Ruth Ann Ward, died on January 6, 2024. She was 71 years old. She had spent the last 32 years building a wholesale floral supply company called Ward Bloom Supply out of a rented commercial unit on Old Wake Forest Road in North Raleigh. She started with $4,000, a second-hand refrigerated van she bought at a county auction, and a spiral notebook full of florist contacts she had collected from church directories, community boards, and trade shows across Wake County. By the time she passed, Ward Bloom Supply was supplying fresh-cut flowers, preserved botanicals, and dried floral arrangements to over 140 retail florists, event planners, and wedding vendors across the Triangle. That's Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. She had 8 full-time employees, a fleet of 2 refrigerated delivery vans, a cold storage unit rated at commercial scale, and a client list that read like a wedding directory for the entire region. She built that from nothing, from 40 years old, with bad knees and a plastic organizer full of business cards. I watched her do it. I helped her do it on weekends when I was in my 20s, loading vans, running invoices, driving deliveries to Chapel Hill florists during the Christmas rush. I loved that company the way you love something that smells like your mother. She left it to me, 100%, in a properly executed will, reviewed and notarized in October 2023, just 3 months before she passed. I didn't know that when she died. I was too deep in grief to think about paperwork. But Sandra knew. Somehow, she knew before the attorney even called me. I didn't find that suspicious at first. I thought she was being supportive. I thought a lot of things about Sandra that turned out to be wrong. The will was read on January 19, 2024, in the office of my mother's attorney, Gerald Tate, on Glenwood Avenue in downtown Raleigh. Sandra sat next to me with her hand on my knee. She wore a dark gray blazer. She looked composed, careful. She was too composed for a woman who had just lost her mother-in-law 3 weeks earlier. I noticed it. I filed it away without knowing why. When Gerald read the transfer, full ownership of Ward Bloom Supply, including all assets, vehicles, inventory contracts, client agreements, and the commercial lease on Old Wake Forest Road, Sandra's hand tightened on my knee. Not a squeeze. A grip, like she was steadying herself. On the drive home, she was quiet for 7 minutes. I know because I watched the clock, wondering what she was thinking. Then she said, "We should sit down this week and talk about the business." "Sure," I said. "I'm still figuring out what I even want to do with it." She nodded. "We should probably get ahead of it sooner than later." I assumed she meant logistics. What to do with the lease, the employees, the inventory, whether to keep it running or sell. I was 44 years old. I worked in commercial real estate, and I had no experience running a floral supply operation. Those were the practical questions I thought she was raising. She was not raising practical questions. The first conversation happened the following Tuesday, January 23rd. We sat at the kitchen table on Whitaker Mill Road, the house we had bought together in 2018, and Sandra slid a single printed page across the table. It was a draft business management agreement. It assigned operational and financial authority for Ward Bloom Supply to Sandra Ward, effective upon my signature, for an initial term of 5 years. I stared at it. "What is this?" "A solution," she said. "You don't know how to run a floral business." "I have an MBA. I've been doing financial consulting for 8 years. I can take it from where your mother left it and grow it into something real." You keep your real estate job. I run the company. We both benefit. Sandra, my mother left this to me, and you're overwhelmed. You said yourself you don't know what you want to do with it. That's different from handing you control of it. She leaned back. I thought we were partners. We are. In our marriage. That's different from a business transfer. She smiled, and that smile sat wrong. Too practiced. Too patient. Like she had rehearsed her way through my objection 5 times before she raised the topic. Just think about it. There's no rush. There was a rush. I just didn't know it yet. By February 3rd, she had raised the subject 4 more times. The conversations escalated slowly. First appeals to practicality, then appeals to partnership, then quiet suggestions that I was being emotionally irrational because of grief. The last one stung. My mother was barely 4 weeks gone. Grief wasn't clouding my judgment. It was clarifying it. On February 7th, I went to Gerald Tate's office alone and asked 2 questions. 1. What did it mean legally for me to sign a management authority agreement? 2. Had anyone else contacted his office about the estate since the will was read? The answer to the second question sat in my chest like a stone. Sandra had called Gerald's office on January 22nd, the day before she showed me that management agreement. She had asked about the legal requirements to transfer business ownership from a sole heir to a spouse. Gerald had declined to discuss it without my presence and flagged the inquiry in the file. She had been moving the pieces before she even showed me the board. I didn't tell Sandra what I'd learned. I went home, cooked dinner, and sat across from her at the table we had shared for 6 years in that house, and realized I was looking at someone I didn't fully recognize. She wasn't grieving with me. She was planning around me. The next week was surface-level normal. She stopped bringing up the agreement. She was warm, present, almost apologetic in her energy, bringing me coffee in the mornings, asking how I was sleeping. I almost softened. That was the point. On the evening of February 14th, yes, Valentine's Day, she suggested we drive out to check on a property I'd been managing in the Brentwood area of North Raleigh, near Durant Road. She said she'd found a florist out that way who she wanted to pitch Ward Bloom as a supplier. She wanted to combine it into a quick drive, said it might be nice to get out of the house. We stopped at a property I knew, a vacant commercial lot with a detached garage the previous tenant had used for equipment storage. The garage sat at the back of the lot behind a chain-link fence. I managed the listing. I had the access code. Sandra knew that. "Can you check the side door?" she said. "I want to see if the rear unit is worth including in the listing." I walked to the garage. I typed in the code. I pushed the door open. I stepped inside. The door slammed. I turned around. The lock engaged from outside. A padlock, not the original keypad. A padlock that had not been there the last time I checked this property. She had brought it. She had planned this. I pressed against the door. "Sandra, open the door." Her voice came through the gap at the bottom, calm as a Sunday morning. "We're just going to have a conversation, Benjamin. Open the door. As soon as you agree to sign the agreement, I'll open the door. It's one signature. It doesn't even take away your ownership. It just gives me authority to operate it. You locked me in a garage. I gave you a quiet place to think." I checked my jacket pocket. My phone was gone. She had lifted it from my coat while I drove. I remembered now, her hand on my arm, a reach across the console. My car keys were in the ignition. She had driven. I was alone, in a metal garage, in Raleigh, North Carolina, in February, with no phone, no heat, no light source other than a thin strip of pale winter sky through a vent near the roofline. I want you to stay with me for a second, because this is the moment that separated everything. Before the garage, I was a grieving son who was frustrated with his wife. After the garage door locked, I was a man who finally understood exactly who he had married. She wasn't going to leave me in there forever. She was going to break me down just enough. That was the plan. Cold, darkness, time, and then I'd sign whatever she put in front of me. She underestimated 3 things: my patience, my stubbornness, and that old Ford F-150 sitting against the far wall of that garage. I gave myself 30 seconds to panic. 30. I counted them out, hands shaking, jaw clenched, heart slamming against my ribs. Then I stopped. Think. The garage was roughly 30 feet by 20, concrete floor, metal walls, a workbench along one side with rusted tools and empty paint cans, a ceiling vent, too high and too narrow to climb through. The original keypad lock was on the inside of the door, but the exterior padlock she'd added had engaged a secondary hasp she must have installed in advance. I checked the original keypad anyway. Disabled. The wire had been cut and tucked back behind the panel. She had been in this garage before today. That detail worked through me slowly. She had scouted this location. She had bought a padlock. She had cut the wire on the interior panel. She had planned this for days, maybe longer, while asking me every morning how I was sleeping and making sure my coffee was hot. 11 years. We had been married 11 years. I checked the perimeter. A small vent near the floor, but screened and rusted shut. No secondary door. One window, high on the south wall, painted over from outside, probably during the commercial tenant's time, and barred with a horizontal iron rod bolted to the frame. I could see light through it, but nothing else. Then I noticed the truck. The Ford F-150 was old, mid-1990s by the look of it. Cream-colored, flat front tires, collecting dust in the far left corner of the garage. The previous commercial tenant had apparently left it behind when they vacated. It had been on the property records as abandoned equipment, something I had noted and never escalated to the landlord. The cab was unlocked. I climbed in mostly to get off the cold concrete floor. The bench seat had an old work blanket folded against the passenger door. I pulled it around my shoulders and sat there in the dark cab of a dead truck and tried to decide what I was going to do. She'll be back in the morning, I told myself. Or someone will see the property listed and call the office. Or Gerald Tate will notice something is wrong. None of those were fast enough. It was February in the mid-40s outside, colder inside the unheated garage. I could already feel it settling into my joints the way cold does when there's nowhere for your body heat to go. I started the mental inventory. What did I know? The landlord checked the property maybe once a month. Nobody else had a key or a code except me. And Sandra now, apparently. My real estate assistant, a man named Doug Patterson, would notice I hadn't checked in by morning, but his first assumption would be a dead phone, not a locked garage. But there was one person. Her name was Rochelle Tatum. She was my mother's operations manager at Ward Bloom Supply. 61 years old, 22 years with the company, and the single most practical human being I had ever known. After my mother passed, I had asked Rochelle to keep the business running on a month-to-month basis while I figured out next steps. She had my emergency contact information on file at the business because Mom had insisted on it. If Benjamin ever goes quiet, call Rochelle, was something my mother had said to me more than once. Rochelle also had a landline at the Ward Bloom office. Not a cell number, a landline. Old habit. My mother had kept it if there was any way to reach someone from inside this garage. It had to be that landline. And that was when I looked down at the Ford's center console and saw it. A CB radio mounted under the dash. Old, dusty, unplugged from the dashboard power, but with a detachable handset still clipped to its mount, and a power cord coiled in the console. A commercial CB radio. This model, I recognized it as a Cobra 29 LTD. A standard long-range CB common on commercial work trucks, ran on 12-volt power from the vehicle. The truck had no engine power, but the battery might still hold enough charge to operate the radio. I pulled the handset. I found the power cord. I plugged it into the vehicle's 12-volt accessory port below the dash. The radio clicked. A red light came on. Faint, but on. I tried channel 19 first, the standard trucking frequency used on most American highways. Nothing but static and a distant diesel engine somewhere miles away. I tried channel 9, the emergency channel designated by the FCC for CB radios. Static, then a voice. Scratchy, broken, but human. Any unit on 9, confirm location if you need. I pressed the transmit button. This is a civilian. I'm locked inside a garage on a commercial property near Durant Road in North Raleigh. I need someone to call. The battery cut out. 10 seconds of power. Maybe less. The red light was gone. I sat in the cold cab of that truck and waited. And I thought about my mother. She used to say the hardest thing in any business wasn't the finances or the competition. It was learning which people you could trust absolutely. Most people, she said, are good, but a few aren't. And the dangerous ones don't announce themselves. They bring you coffee and smile while they do it. Mom, I thought, you tried to warn me about everyone except the person sleeping next to me. I pulled the blanket tighter and settled in for the night. At some point around 3 a.m., I stopped being angry and started being strategic. That shift, from emotion to calculation, was the thing that saved me. Not the radio, not the blanket, not even the call that eventually came. What saved me was the moment I decided to stop pounding on the door and start thinking about what Sandra was planning to do next. Because she wasn't just improvising. She had a timeline. I could feel it. She had locked me in on the evening of February 14th, Valentine's Day, which in hindsight was either deeply ironic or deeply deliberate. The Ward Bloom business had a lease renewal coming up at the end of February. If she could present signed transfer documents to the landlord and the business bank account, First Citizens Bank on Six Forks Road in Raleigh, before that renewal date, she could establish herself as the operating authority before I had time to contest it. The lease renewal paperwork required the signature of the controlling owner. That was me, or it would be her if I signed. She needed my signature, yes, but she also needed me cooperative enough to not immediately call Gerald Tate and report what had happened. That's why the garage wasn't a permanent trap. It was a pressure cooker. Get me cold, get me scared, get me weakened enough that signing felt like relief. She wanted me compliant, not dead. Understanding that kept me calm in a way nothing else could have. I wasn't in mortal danger. I was in a psychological negotiation, and I had just decided I wasn't going to lose it. I kept my body moving. I walked the perimeter of the garage every 20 minutes in the dark, counting steps. 20, 2 steps across the long wall, 14 across the short. I did shallow lunges against the workbench to keep my legs from stiffening. I talked out loud to myself, which sounds unhinged, but it kept my mind from spiraling. I narrated what I was going to do when the door opened. Not if. When. Around 5:30 a.m., I heard tires on gravel outside. I went still. A car door. Footsteps on the concrete outside the garage. Then Sandra's voice, closer than before. She had apparently slept in her car on the property all night, or nearby. Benjamin, are you ready to talk? I walked to the door, slowly, deliberately. Open the door, Sandra. Are you going to sign? I kept my voice even. Open the door and let's discuss it properly. I can't think straight in the cold. A pause. Then, I just need one signature. That's all. Then we go home. We have breakfast and we move forward. Sandra. I put my palm flat against the metal door. I want you to think very carefully about what you've done. Not what you want, what you've done. There's a difference. Another pause. Longer this time. Then footsteps moving away, back to the car. A door closing. She wasn't ready to open it yet. She thought I was softening. I was stalling. Because while I'd been walking the perimeter in the dark, I had made one discovery I hadn't fully processed until now. The workbench along the east wall had, under a layer of grime and old shop rags, a pegboard mounted to the wall. On the pegboard, amid rusted wrenches and empty hooks, was a single item, a square piece of paper, folded in half and stuck behind a hanging socket wrench. It had been there long enough to yellow at the edges. It was a property lease notice from the original tenant, with a phone number on it, stamped 2019, 5 years old, not useful. But behind it, wedged between the pegboard and the wall, was something that was a white plastic emergency whistle on a cord. The kind you put in a first aid kit. Standard issue. I had it in my hand by 6 a.m., standing on top of the workbench, pressing my face as close as I could to the wall vent near the roofline. The vent opened to the north side of the property, facing a service road that ran behind the commercial lots on Durant Road. At 6:45 a.m., I heard it. Tires and an engine. Something heavy. A delivery truck making early rounds on a commercial route. I blew that whistle as hard as I could, for 30 seconds. The truck slowed. I heard it. The engine dropping from a moving tone to idle. I blew again. The truck stopped. Doors. A man's voice, gruff. cautious. Hello? Somebody there? In the garage, I shouted. Locked in. Call 911, please. Call 911. His voice again, retreating slightly. He was on his phone. Yeah. I'm on Durant Road. There's a man locked inside one of these commercial properties. Sounds like he's trapped. Sandra's footsteps came fast on the gravel after that. I heard her talking in a low, fast voice to someone. On her phone, I think. Then more footsteps. Running. A car door. An engine starting. Tires spinning on gravel. She left. The Raleigh Police Department arrived at 7:14 a.m. on February 15, 2024. An officer named Sergeant Dale Hutchins removed the padlock with bolt cutters from a set in his patrol vehicle. When the door swung open and the gray morning light came in, I stood there in my work jacket and that old truck blanket and did something I hadn't done since the day my mother died. I cried. Not from relief, from rage. Because standing in that doorway, finally breathing fresh air, I understood everything. Sergeant Hutchins sat me in the back of his patrol car with the heat running and took my statement. I told him everything. The management agreement, the escalating pressure, the lifted phone, the premeditated padlock, the cut wire on the interior keypad. Sandra's voice through the door asking me to sign. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Mr. Ward, this isn't a domestic dispute. What you're describing is unlawful imprisonment. I want you to pause on that phrase for a second, because I think a lot of people, especially men, don't think about it that way. We're conditioned to believe that if a woman locks a man in a garage, it's a marital argument that got out of hand. We're not conditioned to call it what it is, legally. A crime. Sergeant Hutchins did, without hesitation. The officers located Sandra within 2 hours. She had driven to a friend's house in Garner, about 15 miles south of Raleigh. When they brought her in for questioning, she told them the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that I had gone into the garage voluntarily, that she had thought I was still inside when she left, that she had no idea the door had locked. Which would have been more convincing if the bolt cutters hadn't removed a padlock, a brand new master lock number 3, that had been installed on a hasp that was not on the property lease record and had not been there during my last property check 2 weeks earlier. Someone bought that padlock, someone installed that hasp, someone disabled the interior keypad. Sandra was released pending investigation. She retained a criminal defense attorney by that afternoon. I spent the morning of February 15th at WakeMed North Hospital on Falls of Noose Road in Raleigh. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, bruised knuckles from hitting the door in the first hour. The attending physician kept calling me sir in the way that people use it when they're concerned, but trying not to show it. My real estate assistant, Doug Patterson, was at the hospital by 9 a.m. He had been trying to reach me since 8:30 the previous evening and had apparently driven by both the office and our house before calling Raleigh PD at 6:58 a.m., which meant his call and the delivery driver's call hit dispatch within minutes of each other. Doug is 31 years old, quiet, relentlessly dependable, and he stood in that hospital room and said absolutely nothing for about 90 seconds before he managed, I knew something was wrong when you didn't answer the property alert. Thank you for calling them, I said. He nodded. What do we do now? I thought about that. Call Rochelle Tatum at Ward Bloom. Tell her to change all the locks and access codes today. Nobody goes in or out without her direct authorization. Doug had the phone to his ear before I finished the sentence. Rochelle answered on the second ring. When Doug handed me the phone, and I heard her voice. Steady, no nonsense, the same voice that had been running my mother's warehouse for 22 years. I almost managed to smile. Benjamin. One word, loaded with everything. Hey, Rochelle. I heard. Doug told me, are you all right? I'm better than I was at 3 a.m. A beat. She went after the business. Not a question. Yes. I figured. She called me last week asking about the lease renewal process. Said she was asking on your behalf. I told her to have you call me yourself. She called Rochelle. Sandra had tried to work around me from every direction. Gerald Tate. The bank. Now Rochelle. Change the codes. I said, all of them. Already done, Rochelle said. I changed them the second Doug called. 22 years. My mother had chosen her people carefully. She had left me good ones. Over the next 2 weeks, the picture that emerged was worse than I had imagined in that garage. Gerald Tate reviewed the estate file at my request and found that Sandra had also placed an inquiry with First Citizens Bank using my name, asking about the process for adding a cosigner with operational authority to a business account. The bank had flagged the call as incomplete and misfiled it, but it was there. She had also, through a contact I couldn't immediately identify, sourced a real estate attorney in Durham who had drafted a full business transfer agreement, not the 5-year management authority she had shown me at the kitchen table, but a complete, permanent ownership transfer document dated January 28, 2024, 8 days after my mother's will was read. The document was notarized and ready. It required only my signature. My name had already been typed in the right font, in the right place, like they had already rehearsed me signing it. The Raleigh PD investigation, assisted by a digital forensics firm, traced her correspondence. She had been in contact with a real estate investor named Kevin Pruitt out of Durham, not a florist, not a floral industry buyer, but a commercial property investor with a portfolio of small businesses in the Triangle. Pruitt had an interest in the Ward Bloom supply lease and client book. He had apparently approached Sandra about a possible acquisition sometime in December 2023, before my mother died. Before she died, some betrayals don't start after the funeral. They start while you're still sitting in hospital waiting rooms. I'm going to let that sit for a moment, because I think it's important. Sandra hadn't become opportunistic when she learned about the inheritance. She had been planning with Pruitt while my mother was still alive, banking on an outcome she had decided was inevitable. She hadn't been grieving with me. She had been managing a timeline. The morning of February 29, 2024, a leap year, as it happened. I walked into Gerald Tate's office on Glenwood Avenue and spent 2 hours going through what the investigation had produced. Gerald is a measured man. He uses words like concerning and noteworthy when other attorneys would use words I can't say on this channel. But that morning, he looked at the timeline we had assembled and said, plainly, Benjamin, your wife attempted to steal your inheritance, and when that failed, she committed a felony. I know. You need a family law attorney in addition to Gerald, and possibly a separate civil attorney for the business claims. I know that too. He paused. How are you doing? Outside of this. I thought about that for a second. About the garage. About the blanket. About my mother saying a few people aren't good, and the dangerous ones don't announce themselves. I'm clear, I said. That's the best I can offer right now. I retained a family law attorney named Patricia Osei, who practiced out of an office on Hillsborough Street in Raleigh. She was 52, direct, and had the kind of calm that made you feel like she had handled worse things than your situation before 9 a.m., and would handle several more before lunch. She reviewed the criminal investigation, the draft transfer documents, the bank inquiry, and the Kevin Pruitt correspondence. And she looked at me and said, Do you want to try to save the marriage? No. She nodded once, like she had expected that answer. Then, let's make sure you're protected. On March 4, 2024, Sandra Ward was formally charged with unlawful imprisonment, criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, and fraudulent impersonation. The last charge, stemming from her call to First Citizens Bank using my name to inquire about the account. Her attorney attempted to negotiate the unlawful imprisonment charge down to misdemeanor false imprisonment, arguing that Sandra had not intended me to be in danger and had not anticipated the temperature or duration of the confinement. The prosecutor declined. The premeditated padlock, the disabled keypad, the prepared transfer documents. These were not the actions of a woman who panicked. They were the actions of a woman who planned. I want to talk about something here that doesn't get discussed enough in stories like this. 1. The experience of being a man who was victimized by a woman in a domestic context, in a way that involved physical restraint and coercion, and then navigating the legal and social systems that were built mostly without that scenario in mind. I was lucky. Sergeant Hutchins treated it like what it was from the first minute. The prosecutor did her job without equivocation. Gerald Tate and Patricia Osei were thorough and professional. The forensics team found what they needed to find. But I talked to other men in the weeks that followed, through the support community my attorney connected me with, who had experienced something similar and been told it was a domestic argument, or been laughed at. or been dismissed because the physical dynamics didn't fit the expected picture. The assumption that men can't be trapped, coerced, or victimized by a spouse is not just wrong, it is dangerous. It leaves real people without the legal protection they are owed. Coercion does not require physical strength. It requires power. And power in a marriage can come from many places: financial control, social isolation, psychological manipulation, or in my case, a premeditated plan and a padlock bought at a hardware store. The case taught me that. And I believe it's worth saying out loud. Kevin Pruitt's involvement became the civil matter. Patricia Osei and Gerald Tate, working together, filed a civil action in Wake County Superior Court against both Sandra Ward and Kevin Pruitt for conspiracy to defraud, intentional interference with inheritance, and unjust enrichment. The draft transfer document Pruitt's attorney had prepared, dated January 28th, while my mother had been dead for only 3 weeks, became the centerpiece of the claim. Pruitt's legal team argued he had done nothing improper, that he had simply responded to a business inquiry from Sandra as a potential seller. The flaw in that argument was the date. My mother's will wasn't even filed with the court until January 25th. Pruitt's transfer document was dated January 28th. He had moved within days of the estate becoming a matter of public record, which meant someone had been watching for that filing. That someone was Sandra, and Pruitt had been waiting for the call. Pruitt settled the civil claim in May 2024, agreeing to pay a sum I won't disclose, but which was meaningful, and to a permanent non-disparagement and non-solicitation agreement prohibiting him from approaching any Ward Bloom Supply client, employee, or vendor for commercial purposes. He also, as a condition of the settlement, provided a full written statement detailing the communications between himself and Sandra from December 2023 through February 2024. That statement became part of the criminal file. It confirmed that Sandra had approached Pruitt in early December, 2 months before my mother died, with a proposal: if Sandra could deliver controlling authority over Ward Bloom Supply, Pruitt would pay her a finder's fee and retain her in a consultancy role. She had gone shopping for a buyer before she'd even gone shopping for black clothes to wear to my mother's funeral. Sandra's criminal case resolved in August 2024. She accepted a plea agreement, 2 felony counts, criminal conspiracy and unlawful imprisonment, reduced from the original charging document in exchange for a guilty plea and a negotiated sentence. She received 36 months of supervised probation, a $15,000 restitution payment to the estate for legal costs incurred in defending the business, and a permanent civil protection order prohibiting her from having any contact with Ward Bloom Supply employees, clients, or vendors. She served no jail time. Her attorney argued, first offense, no physical injury, remorse. I was asked by the prosecutor's office whether I objected to the plea. I didn't, not because I forgave her, because sending her to prison would have extended the entanglement between us, and what I wanted, more than punishment, was separation. Clean. Final. Document. Our divorce was finalized in October 2024. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. The Ward Bloom Supply business, inherited solely from my mother and never commingled with marital assets, was excluded from the marital estate entirely on the basis of inheritance law. She received her share of the house on Whitaker Mill Road, the joint savings, and the jointly owned vehicle. I kept everything my mother built. That was always how it should have been. Ward Bloom Supply, as of today, February 2025, is intact. Rochelle Tatum is still the operations manager. She also accepted a 5% ownership stake, something I structured with Gerald Tate in November 2024. She cried when I told her. Then she said, "Your mother would have done this years ago," which was exactly right and slightly embarrassing. We expanded the cold storage unit in January 2025, adding capacity for 2 additional floral categories, tropical imports and specialty preserved botanicals, that my mother had wanted to add but hadn't had the capital for. The client list grew by 11 accounts in the second half of 2024, partly because the stability of the business through the legal turmoil gave vendors and florists confidence. Doug Patterson joined as my part-time operations liaison, coordinating between my real estate work and Ward Bloom scheduling. He still hasn't said more than is necessary about any of it. That's one of the things I value most about him. I sold the house on Whitaker Mill Road in December 2024. I live now in a smaller house in the Mordecai neighborhood near downtown Raleigh, 2 miles from my mother's old commercial unit on Old Wake Forest Road. Some mornings I drive past the warehouse before I go to the office. I don't always go in. Sometimes I just sit in the car and look at it. The lights on, vans loading, Rochelle's truck in the lot. And think about what my mother built from 40 years old with bad knees and a spiral notebook. She gave that to me, and I kept it. That's the whole story. Except for one last thing. The garage on the Durant Road property. I contacted the landlord in March 2024, disclosed what had happened, and asked whether he wanted to retain me as his listing agent. He did. The property sold in September 2024 to a local HVAC contractor who needed the space for equipment storage. Before he took possession, I walked back into that garage one last time. I returned the work blanket to the cab of the Ford F-150. I found the CB radio handset still in its clip. I don't know if the battery in that truck is dead now. I don't know if anyone will ever plug in that old Cobra 29 again. But I left it exactly where it was. Because somewhere, through 10 seconds of power and an emergency channel and a delivery driver named Terry, whose last name I never got, it sent a signal out into the dark. And someone answered. That's what I want you to remember from this story. When you're locked in somewhere cold and alone and convinced that no one is listening, keep transmitting. Use whatever you have. An old radio, a plastic whistle, a single name you trust. You don't need a full signal. You need 10 seconds and the right frequency. My mother built a business from 40 years old in a city where nobody owed her anything. She made it work because she refused to stop when stopping would have been easier. She left me that same instruction, not in words, but in what she built. And when Sandra tried to take it, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I came back. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.